Thank you so much. I just want to thank Magda, Wes, Shaban, and Belinda for participating in this wonderful series that I had the privilege of working on this past year. Um, this presentation is about an American Jewish community, and I'm just going to share my screen to start us off. Okay. This presentation is about an American Jewish community. I say American in the broadest sense. And by this, I mean a Jewish community that exists culturally in the Caribbean, but also in South America, and whose members shaped the historical identity of North American and European Jews through their emigration to the United States and Europe. Suriname has long been on the radar of Jewish studies scholars. Three of the classic Jewish historians, Heinrich Gretz, Marcus Jost, and Simon Dubnov, all mention Jewish Suriname in their histories, even though they get its character slightly wrong. Gretz and Dubnov misidentify this mainland South American country on the Guyanese Shield as an island, while Jost, remarking on their autonomy that made the Jews of Suriname famous, he called their capital Haddo Savannah, rather than Joden Savannah or Jews Savannah, as it had been identified on most European maps. Indeed, for much of the past 150 years of Jewish studies scholarship, Suriname was often mentioned and described as an anomalous site of Jewish freedom, cultural independence, and autonomy, where being Jewish meant not only to be left alone, but also to raise a standing Jewish militia to vanquish rebellious slaves, and to participate as European equals in a slave system that shaped the Atlantic world. This paradox between Jewish freedom and Black oppression, as Aviva Ben-Or and Andrew R. Hines have masterfully shown in very different contexts, serves as the dialectic upon which scholars, Jewish studies scholars, have described not only Caribbean Jewish culture, but the culture of American Jews as a whole. This presentation shifts our lens onto the Jewish Caribbean after the end of slavery and after the end of the Jewish autonomy that slavery afforded the Jews. My concern here is illuminating the lives of Jewish cultural activists in Paramaribo, Suriname, and to explore the meaning of the transition in Suriname from Iberian Portuguese Jewish domination to the numerical and cultural ascendance of Jews affiliated with the Ashkenazic synagogue in Paramaribo, and the relationship of this synagogue and its cultural sphere to the rise of Jewish interests in Zionism, socialism, and anti-colonial nationalism in Surinamese society. My second concern with this project is the occluded story of the colonial sphere during the Nazi Holocaust and Surinamese victims of the Nazi Holocaust. As Nadege Veldwachter has noted, most scholars have consistently read efforts to construct the history of Black or Caribbean presences in the Holocaust in the limited terms of African, Afro-German, or Afro-American Negrophobia. But from 1942 to 1945, Caribbean people, including people from Suriname, took part in the anti-fascist resistance movements, both in the Caribbean and in the metropole, and they shared the same concentration camp spaces with Jews, and by extension, they inhabited related realms of memory. Despite the archival authentication of this fact, there is little trace of these shared realms in historical narratives of the war in general and of the Holocaust in particular. Thus, this project illuminates the lives and the political conditions of over 100 Surinamese Jews who were murdered by the Nazis, and evokes the life of Suriname's greatest national hero, Anton de Kom, who was interned and put to death at the hands of the German occupiers for the crime of exposing the link between colonial and metropolitan oppressions in the underground communist press. I therefore concentrate on the Caribbean Jewish experience leading up to and under European fascism, and demonstrate that it encapsulates the tensions inherent in the models of citizenship and belonging that underwrite, even to this day, Europeans' relationship with its Jewish and its colonial past. My central argument as we go through this slideshow will be that while scholars of the Caribbean have recently focused on the Creolization of Jewish culture in the Caribbean, this term has not been vetted as a tool for describing the genesis of Jewishness in post-abolition Suriname. While there has been a tendency to backshadow concepts of Creolite from the 1980s French Caribbean context onto Jewish culture in the Caribbean, this concept elides the role that religion, or really Christian theological conceptions of what a Jew is, resisted the sense that Jews were authentically Creole. This resistance to being identified as Creole, shared by Jews and non-Jews alike, contributed to the separation of Jewish intellectuals and Jewishness from Creole political and cultural identity. Thus, as I hope to show in this presentation, and in the research project as a whole, while the Jews of Suriname were largely Sranan-Tongo speakers, the local Creole speakers, brown-skinned in appearance and born in Suriname, they maintained an ambivalent and thus dynamic shifting relationship to the West African and African diasporic elements in their daily lives, not out of a rejection of Africanness as a type of colonial stigma, but because they rejected the foundational Christian theologies that formed the basis of anti-colonial politics in Suriname. And what you're looking at right now are three images of the journal that really forms the source material for this presentation. Much of what I say is drawn from 3 decades of this journal's run. And this really is in many ways a record of Surinamese-Jewish self-presentation as it exists in their local press. We'll move on to the next slide here. So just to introduce Suriname to those who are not familiar with it, Jewish settlement in Suriname dates from the 17th century and is inextricably bound up with early Dutch colonial expansion. As Aviva Ben-Or has shown in her recent communal history, in the New World, Jews of the Portuguese nation were given the opportunity to participate in plantation farming as the owner of estates. And in the 17th and 18th century, their increased wealth and experience as planters made a handful of Portuguese Jewish families a pillar of the colony's European social apparatus. At the same time, the vast majority of Iberian Jews in Suriname were of poor, quote, despachado status, meaning that they had been transferred to the colony to ease the burden on the Iberian Jewish charities in the city of Amsterdam. These Portuguese Jews existed in a rural tropical landscape where Jews and non-Jews interacted in relative privacy. In a recent array of scholarship, scholars have begun to articulate the ways in which Jews were in persistent social contact with the African people that they enslaved. And in particular, as Aviva Ben-Or and Stan Mervis have presented, the sexual violence endemic to all slave societies in its Jewish contexts. Throughout the era of slavery and thereafter, sex between free Jewish men and enslaved African women gradually transformed a sizable portion of Jewish community members into what was called in Suriname in the 19th century coloreds or kleurlingen. What follows from these new path-breaking studies of early Atlantic Jewry, early Surinamese Jewry, is a need to bring into sharp relief the radical reversals and changes that were brought about by the decline and the end of the slave system. My project is embedded in this gap and will focus on Jewish culture, primarily from the Ashkenazic Jewish community after the abolition of slavery in 1863, an era that has been explored relatively little by scholars of Jewish culture. There's not much written about this period, and most of what has been written focuses on a smattering of archival sources, since the complete records of the Ashkenazic synagogue, presumably held at the National Archives in Suriname, are so far not accessible to scholars, including myself. I made an attempt. Thus, this paper is an attempt to understand the self-presentation of Suriname's Jews through a close study of their intelligentsia and its journal Terua, and which ran from 1939 to 1969. Most of the material in this presentation, like I said, will derive from information that was presented in that magazine that I just showed you right here. So what's important, I think, to note is that in the era of slavery, say between 1640 and 1863, the Jewish geography of Suriname was largely confined to the plantations. And you can see on the left here an early map of Suriname, and then right there in the middle it says Jewish village and synagogue, and then you'll see some recognizably Sephardic Jewish names surrounding that Jewish village and synagogue, like Baruch de Costa, Avram de Pina, Yosef Nasi, and Garrett Jacobs. Garrett Jacobs was one of the few, but not the only Ashkenazic Jewish planter, and he came from the Baltic coast of Lithuania in the early 1700s to Suriname. What's important to note during this era, which sort of precedes what we're going to go into in this presentation, is that there was continuous and persistent resistance by enslaved people and the creation of maroon villages to the south of the Jewish plantations across the Cassipoura Creek and into what is today French Guiana. The Hebrew text that you see at the bottom of the map is one page of a supplicatory prayer that was handwritten by the cantor, by the chazan of the synagogue in that Jewish village you see on the map, asking God for protection from these maroon attacks. So it is important to note, I think, from the beginning, that resistance on the part of the enslaved and then by the maroons who were self-emancipated and living in the interior was a defining feature of Jewish life in the era of slavery. And this particular prayer was written in response to the killing of a Ashkenazic Jewish watchman in Yoden Savannah. But as we move on, we're going to shift our focus not to the era of slavery and the lands that were covered by plantations, but to the dawn of the 19th century and the development of an Ashkenazic Jewish community, that is a Jewish community with its roots in Northern Europe, German and Central Europe, in Paramaribo, the capital city of the colony of Suriname. And here you have pictured the synagogue of this, the Ashkenazic synagogue, which the community itself was established in 1735, but the building, which still exists today, was built in 1842, almost at the end of the slavery era in 1863. And it was built by enslaved people. The work logs and the names of the enslaved people that were forced to build this synagogue are now actually in the archives of the American Jewish Archives. Now, the Ashkenazic synagogue was established in 1703 by Jewish settlers from Amsterdam, the Baltic coast of Lithuania, and elsewhere. And these Jews came to the Caribbean speaking Dutch, Yiddish, German, Danish, and by 1780, it was observed in Paramaribo that Ashkenazic Jewish women conversed with enslaved women in their household, quote, Negro English, which is referred today as Suriname Tongo, the English-based Creole language spoken as a lingua franca, much to the chagrin of the Portuguese Jewish observer who recorded their exchange. Even by the 1930s, it was remarked that Yiddish words had also entered the urban and rural dialects of Suriname Tongo. And for example, the Yiddish word known more in Western Yiddish than Eastern Yiddish, kufnun, which is kuf nun, the letters, the Hebrew letters pushed together, meaning kostet nichts, without cost or free, was in use among Afro-Creole storekeepers. Now, this is a photograph, if you were to be facing with your back to the synagogue that I just showed you, you would be looking down a street called Joden Breestraat, Jews Broadway. And you can see from this photograph, if you peek towards the end of this street, you can see the Suriname River. This constituted the center of the Jewish quarter of Paramaribo, and it will come up as we continue with the slides. Now, I just want to note, sort of to give us a sense of the proportion of Jews in Paramaribo into the 19th century. In 1668, there were only 9 plantations working in Suriname, and 6 of those plantations were in Jewish ownership. In 1730, there were about 400 plantations working in Suriname, and 115 of those plantations were in Jewish ownership. What developed into the course of the 19th century are 2 constituent Creole dialects that constitute the Surinamese-Creole. The first is an English-based Creole due to the former English occupation of Suriname and the English colonization of Suriname, as well as what was called Jew Tongo, which, you guessed it, was a Creole language influenced by the Portuguese of the Jewish planters. Now, as we move on from Joden Briestraat and we move into the middle of the 19th century, something very important happens within the Jewish community. And it happens in concert with the strengthening of Dutch colonial oversight in the colony. Suriname, in the era of slavery, was kind of left, in a sense, to its own devices. And as slavery declined, the Dutch government felt that the colony needed guidance and structure, a sort of governmental structure. And so over time, the Dutch exhibit more political and cultural control in the colony. One aspect of this increased colonial oversight is an interest among the Dutch Jewish community in making contact with the Jewish community in Suriname. And so they send a rabbi, Moses Judah Levenstein, to Paramaribo in 1858. And they impose upon the community a kind of Central European German neo-Orthodoxy. If you're familiar with rabbis like Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who was a separatist Orthodox rabbi in Germany, someone like Levenstein would be considered to the left of someone like Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. And he arrives in the colony to communicate a new form of Jewish identity, which is called, from this point, Netherlands Israelite. And what you can see from the Hebrew text below is something very curious and will be noted by scholars of Jewish studies, which is that he's described here as the chief rabbi of both the Ashkenazic and Sephardic community in Suriname, a highly unusual formation around the world, even in municipalities where a Sephardic community and an Ashkenazic community coexisted. There was usually quite a distinct separation socially and culturally between the two communities. One of the functions of the Dutch government in the 19th century was to increase colonial oversight more generally, and the Basin of Amsterdam sort of carried on this sense in the Jewish community itself. And here we have 2 examples of Levenstein, his installation as chief rabbi in Paramaribo in 1858, and then a service that was held under his auspices commemorating the emancipation of enslaved people in Suriname. This is sort of an example, an early example of what would become in Suriname Ketikoti, which is a festival, a holiday in Suriname commemorating the emancipation and freeing of enslaved people in the colony. These 2 documents are also in the American Jewish Archives. Now, another aspect of Jewishness and the politics of being Jewish in Suriname at this time is the arrival of radical demographic changes in the country. Beginning in the 1870s, and I think more likely in the 1880s, and carrying on through the decades, The Dutch colonial authorities believed in preserving a plantation economy at this point and brought in indentured labor from British India and from the Dutch East Indies, from Java, into the colony, taking a bunch of people from various sites in northwestern India and in Indonesia to work on agricultural estates that had previously been worked by enslaved people of African descent. Now, what's interesting about this photograph, which is in the archives of Leiden University in the Netherlands, is that one can really get a sense of the diversity of people who are arriving in the colony at this time. And although it's certainly not verifiable, one wonders if the man in that photograph to the left of the man in the front with the pith helmet is Jewish. We know at this time from the journal Teruah that Eastern European Jews fleeing oppression in Eastern Europe, pogroms in Eastern Europe, were finding themselves in the port of Amsterdam, and a trickle came to Suriname and affected the self-presentation of the community, as we will see. Now, we're going to introduce from this point one of the main protagonists in this project, and that is Abraham Philip Sampson and his wife, Harriet Elizabeth Morfugo. Abraham Philip Sampson and his wife were pillars of the Ashkenazic synagogue Neve Shalom in the early 20th century. But what's important at this point to say about Abraham Philip Sampson, and we'll come back to him, is that he was born in 1872. He was the first generation of Jewish people in Suriname to be born in an era in which slavery did not exist, and also to be born in Suriname and raised in Suriname in an era in which Christianity was an ascendant political and religious ideology. What's important to note at this point, and we'll see this as we reacquaint ourselves with Abraham Philip Sampson throughout the rest of the presentation, is that the era of slavery in Dutch Suriname was unique in some senses because the Dutch forbid enslaved people to become Christian. And so Christianity was introduced to the colony after the end of slavery. The religious system that was most exposed to many enslaved people in Suriname was Judaism. And this really served to complicate the Christian missionaries' objectives in the colony. So here's just some pictures to give a sense of the world in which Abraham Philip Sampson lived. Here's a picture of a Creole woman with cones of sugar in a lemonade factory in Paramaribo. This was a time in which many Creole people of African descent were moving from interior plantations where they had been enslaved to the coast, to Paramaribo, and some became involved in industrial labor. This is a lemonade factory, like I said, and a very poignant photograph of the daily life of a person in this situation. The visual archive in the early 19th century also gives us a sense that indentured laborers were present in the city on their way probably to rural estates. And here you can see a Creole boy or a young man looking upon some people from British India around the turn of the century. Also in the early 20th century, there was a fairly large delegation of Maroon Grandman or captains, it's often translated into English, who would come to Paramaribo to conduct negotiations with the colonial government. They were, for much of their history, afforded a kind of cultural autonomy and certainly a geographic autonomy, a geographic isolation. And so Maroons were also part of the cultural landscape of Abraham Philip Sampson's childhood. Now, Abraham Philip Sampson is going to come up later because A lot of what he writes in Terua in the journal that we'll discuss a little bit later is about the rise of anti-Semitism in the colony, and in particular, a moment of anti-Jewish violence in 1891. And so I'm going to read a little bit and capture for the audience a sense of what exactly went on in 1891 vis-a-vis Jewish-Christian relations in the colony and Jewish Creole relations in the colony. With the appointment in 1889 of Savorgnan Lohman as the governor of the colony, a political dispute between the governor and the colonial states began. The colonial states were a local representative government body of Surinamese people who purportedly advocated for the people of Suriname and advocated on the people of Suriname's behalf with the colonial governor. And they were also charged with implementing government services in the colony. So schools, hospitals, the care of people who had leprosy, prisons, and tax collection. The Jewish community in Suriname faced the appointment of Lohman with anxiety because they knew that in the Netherlands he had published articles about the Talmud that caused the Jews of Suriname to look upon him as an anti-Semite. And soon after his appointment, the governor collided with the colonial states. Now, I should say at this point that because the Jews of Suriname remained in the colony when many other European white people left the colony, or European affiliated people left the colony after the decline of slavery, the colonial states, the people who were in the colonial states, were largely Jewish. They were Creole Jews, many of them of partial African descent, but they were representatives of the colonial government. So soon after his appointment, the governor, being antagonistic to Jews from his publications in the Netherlands, collided with the colonial states. The colonial states was responsible for collecting taxes from small share farmers in the area close to Paramaribo, an area that had historically been the site of mostly Jewish plantations. And when the farmers of Para, all of them descendants of enslaved Africans, refused to pay their taxes, their refusal was ultimately accepted by Lohman, who used the labor dispute to stir up anti-Semitism and hostility to the colonial states. The governor considered the colonial states a bastion of the Jews who only criticized his policies. Now, in these conflicts with the colonial states, the governor sought for and received support from the Moravian mission, the Herrnhuters, who are also called in English the quote, Negro Church. A majority of the lower Black working class affiliated with this religious community, which was controlled by white missionaries. And here's a picture of the colonial states in the early 20th century. And here is a picture of Creoles from the Para district with two Moravian missionaries in Paramaribo in 1885. And I've shown on the top right, you can see up close the two Moravian missionaries there. Now, the Herrnhuters, the Moravians, had every interest in an alliance with the colonial governor. It gave them prestige and aided their missionary work. And the middle and upper classes, mostly light-skinned Creoles of color, mainly Christian, considered it inappropriate for Moravians to be placed on a pedestal above the Reform and the Lutheran Church, to which they themselves belonged. Now, as time went on with this conflict with the colonial states, it turned into a kind of anti-Jewish campaign. And at the instigation of the governor, in cooperation with the mission started publishing a newspaper in Creole in 1890. And this newspaper, for the most part, published anti-Semitic articles. And as a result of the polarized atmosphere in the colony, people in the Netherlands spoke of a racial, class, and religious struggle. Now, the culmination of this conflict between the colonial states, and the governor, um, it culminated in the governor inviting these farmers from the interior to Paramaribo for what was called a banya, or a vinti pre, a party or a festival in which Afro-Surinamese people encounter their gods. And for 3 days, the capital of Paramaribo was the scene of drumming and celebration in defiance of government overreach, as well as destruction and looting in protest against taxation. Particularly the Jewish quarter, as I showed you before, Joden Briestrat, was completely destroyed. And it wasn't until the colonial states pressed officials in the Netherlands that the police were able to quell the disturbance. There was one death by the colonial states police against one of the protesters. Now, the anti-Jewish climate in the days of the Governor Lohman had important repercussions. And between 1891 and 1910, the Jewish presence in Suriname decreased visibly. This was partly connected with the departure of many Surinamese-Jewish families for the Netherlands. The manifest anti-Semitic climate after 1889 may can be considered one of the causes of this emigration. And now from here, from this moment of anti-Jewish violence, we're going to encounter Abraham Philip Sampson and his journal, Teruah, and understand how they dealt as people, as Jewish people who remained in the colony, how they dealt with this particular missionary atmosphere. So just to locate ourselves now in the 1920s, here is a picture of the Fernandez family. They were members of the Portuguese non-Ashkenazic synagogue. And this is in many ways a typical portrait of a Jewish family in Suriname. Many children, Black clothing denoting piety, and the wife in traditional Kotomisi, Afro-Creole dress, and the children in what is considered colonial Dutch dress. We'll go from there. Now, as we discuss sort of how the rise of Creole nationalism and Creole politics as evinced in the 1890s develops, it's important to understand what exactly Creole or Suriname means in this particular context. So first, Suriname is a language, a Creole language, and it has very many different dialects: Suriname Tongo, Jew Tongo, what is called Negro English, Bakra Tongo, which was the Creole of people associated with Europe, and it was sometimes referred to as Taki Taki by Europeans. This was a pejorative term. Now, as I was talking about anti-Jewish violence in the 1890s in the colony, Suriname identity became a Christian, Black, anti-colonial political identity. And the reason I say this is to distinguish it from the ways in which Creolization has been applied in Jewish studies contexts, mostly from the perspective of the 1980s of Creolity, this kind of hybrid culture consisting of African, European, indigenous, and other elements. I really, for the purposes of this project, have set aside that definition and looked at Creole and Suriname identity more strictly in its political formations. Here's a picture of the synagogue of the Portuguese Israelites, a picture of Joden Briestrat, Jews Broadway in Paramaribo in 1922, and then a picture of Kaiserstraat with the synagogue towards the left in the background, and the Hotel Smith and the offices of the Journal of Teruah next to it. As we move on, we'll see here a picture of the regents of the Ashkenazic synagogue in the 1920s. And we'll see here the black arrow is pointing to Abraham Philip Sampson, and the red arrow is pointed to his son, Philip Abraham Sampson. So they just reverse the names, and that's how it goes. Now, Abraham Sampson had many children, and he had another child, Marcus Abraham Sampson. The blue arrow points to Marcus Abraham Sampson. This is a photo from a wedding party on the side of the Ashkenazic synagogue. Marcus Abraham Sampson is important for this project because he took a path that was very important to Surinamese Jewry. He moved to the Netherlands with his wife, Daisy Henriette Sampson, born Ezekiels. Both of them were born in Paramaribo. And in the course of the 1920s, as I said, the moments of anti-Jewish violence spurred a lot of Jewish people from Suriname to move to Europe. And he is a perfect example, and his wife as well, is a perfect example of this move to Amsterdam and to other municipalities in the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, he established a pharmacy, and he was a doctor of pharmacy. Another prominent family that was instrumental in the formation of the journal was the Samuels family, Jacques Samuels, and their daughter Hannah Samuels, there with the red arrow, marries Abraham Philip Sampson's son Philip, who remains in Suriname, and this is a picture of their wedding day in Paramaribo in 1928. One of the things that the journal elucidates very clearly over its 3 decades is the contribution that Surinamese Jews made to the development of an educational system in Paramaribo. And here we have the considered sort of the father of the Surinamese educational system, H.D. Benjamins. Here he's there in the black jacket and the white vest, surrounded by various political and government figures in the colony at the time. And then we have these remarkable photographs of the Sampson clan and others as school teachers and educators in the Paramaribo school system. And you can see from this photograph the diversity of students. You have Javanese, Indian, African, European students, and E.J. Sampson, I think a cousin of Abraham Philip Sampson there on the right. You have another photograph of an older classroom, Theodore Engelbertus Judah. He was actually obviously the scion of a Jewish family in Suriname, but a convert to the Catholic Church, noting the successful efforts of the Christian missions to attract many members of the Jewish community to the church, which also left a kind of fraught dynamic between many in the Jewish community in Suriname. Here is the picture from the Emma School. A member of the Jewish community is the teacher here. And this was about agricultural productivization among poor lower class Creoles who had moved to Paramaribo. Just another example of how Jewishness is presented in the visual archive. Here we have Europeans to the left, African Creoles to the right, and the second from the right is a Jewish woman, and it's meant to show the diversity of the colony at this point and its traditional dress. Of course, the head of the hospital is dressed in traditional Netherlands Dutch dress. Here's another picture of Richel Sampson, a member of the Jewish community at another school in Paramaribo in 1931. Now, we'll move now to take a quick look, I'd say, at the development of this journal, which really forms the flesh of this project. Here we have the first issue on the left, and the second issue, or not the second issue, but an issue that doesn't come too far after that, a couple years after that. And this issue has the seal of Suriname on the front and shows and is about the service held in the synagogue, the Ashkenazic synagogue, as a memorial service after the Surinamese Jews began to understand what was happening in the Netherlands to the Jewish community. Now you can see from the masthead that the editorships were a mix of people: Eisenman, Arias, Oppenheim, Sampson, and a mixture of Ashkenazic and Portuguese Jewish names. Now, one of the things that comes up in the journal very prominently is the fact that Surinamese Jews were worried that there were Nazis among them, and this was compounded by the fact that the Dutch government imported Dutch Nazis and interned them at Jodensavanne in the 1940s. And one ironic twist of this internment of Dutch Nazis was that they were responsible for the first clearing of Jodensavanne's ruins. So these Nazis were responsible for clearing the jungle. And here you have a picture of the Creole Cemetery, that is the cemetery of Jews of mixed race adjacent to Jodensavanne, and a picture of an American soldier who had occupied Suriname to protect the bauxite mines on the ruins of the synagogue at the Jodensavanne. Other interesting aspects of this journal, they regularly publish advertisements in Creole in Suriname. So this says, countryman, don't make a mistake. Amstel beer, you should buy. You can recognize as an English speaker, Jo must buy, you must buy. On the right side, you have modernist poetry by Abraham Philip Sampson that is written in a mixture of Dutch and some Suriname Tango. You also have interesting expressions of Jewish cuisine, particular local recipes for Passover that required no flour. And even today, there are many foods in Suriname that are ascribed to Jewish creation. You can see on the right, there's a pindabanket, a peanut cookie drawn from the primacy of peanuts in Afro-Creole cuisine, and a cassava boya, which will be familiar to Creole speakers of many varieties, which is a kind of cassava cake or a cassava roll. Again, totally kosher for Passover. There were other aspects of the journal. The development of, sort of games. Daisy Henriette Sampson, Marcus's wife, contributed kinds of like modernist puzzles to the journal. And there were other articles that were of interest, historical interest and religious interest. Here you can see some writing on the Midrash, on rabbinic writings, as well as poetry by D. Planktonius, which is the pen name of Abraham Philip Sampson. As Creole politics becomes more militant into the 1950s, you see a identification happening between the Jewish community and its political character with the Hindustani parties, that is, the parties that represented people from India and indentured labor. And by 1954, the Jewish Journal was actually printed by Sheikh Mohammed Jamaluddin. You can see there on the masthead that the journal is then printed by someone responsible for the preservation of Islam in the colony. And you just have, for visual sake, a picture of the street in which the journal was printed. Over time, things become, a little bit, less exciting. There's depictions of the queen, the princess's arrival in the colony, poetry of a religious nature. And then most importantly, I think in sort of hammering home the argument against a kind of Jewish Creole identity is the development of the Surinamese-Zionist Union, which here is a picture of that union that came together in the late 1930s and developed over time. Here's a picture from 1946 of those members, including Philip Sampson. This was also created in response to a plan by the Dutch government to settle Jewish refugees in Suriname. Some Surinamese Jewish people were for this, including Philip Sampson's brother Hans. But in general, Terua explains quite vividly about how hostile the Surinamese Jewish community was to the arrival of Eastern European Jewish refugees in Suriname, most notably based, I think, on the history that was catalyzed by the anti-Jewish disturbances of 1890. And here you have a late picture of Herzl in 1954, an interesting image, of course, it being printed by John Maludin himself. Now, I'll conclude by sort of circling back to what I was talking about in the very beginning of the talk, which is that Suriname is a very important site for understanding the relationship of Caribbean Jews to the Holocaust. Marcus Abraham Sampson, as well as his wife Daisy and their two children, one not pictured here, were deported from the Netherlands to Auschwitz and murdered by the Nazis. Terua spends much of its pages in the late 40s describing the experience the experience of losing so many of their family members in what was obviously an already complicated relationship with the metropole. Now we can see from this late photograph in 1948 that the synagogue building had its windows removed and set on the ground. The roof, obviously in a state of relative disrepair, and the community itself quite wounded and depleted from the experience of the war. And I'll just conclude with a photo of Abraham Philip Sampson here. In 1959, he passes away, and this more or less marks the end of the journal. Here's Philip A. Sampson in the Netherlands in the 1960s. And here's some pictures I took of Jews Broadway in 2018. Vestiges of Jewishness still exist, of course, such as the Hotel Krasnopolski, beautiful Poland in downtown Paramaribo, photo of a street in Paramaribo, and the Suriname River. And I will conclude there.
I think I get to talk now. Thank you so much, Eli, for that extraordinary piece of scholarship. I've been a scholar of Caribbean literature, primarily Anglophone Caribbean literature and culture for a while now, and I'm always astounded by what I don't know, that I am constantly learning about a region that I'm supposed to know something about. And your presentation here today has been just an extraordinary learning experience on many levels. So thank you so much for what you've given us here. I'm also reminded of just how rich the Dutch Caribbean is in terms of its intellectual output, the discourses it produced, that I think in the terms of the wider Caribbean, the Francophone, Anglophone, Hispanophone Caribbean, we don't speak enough amongst ourselves. So hopefully this conversation will be generative of that beginning. When I was first asked to participate in this conversation, at first I saw the title of your project and it was a Creole Ambivalence, and I thought, oh, great. I'm very interested in Creolization, Creole cultures. And as I read some of your materials and as I listened to your presentation, I had that moment of ambivalence, like, oh no, I know so little. The term Creole is so unstable. As I think you and I have both mentioned, it shifts and it changes historically, so that in some ways, those of us who are supposed to be scholars of Creolization, who are scholars of Creole communities, are still always a bit behind the 8 ball, or not quite up to date with what this term means. And part of what I was wondering as I listened to your presentation is, why do we have this investment in the term Creole that we do, historically speaking, and to the present day? It is still a very dynamic term, a very charged term. It can mean many things in terms of different ethnic groups. It can mean different things in terms of a language. It is a remarkably unstable and yet enduring term. And so I think my first set of questions or comments will be around the term Creole itself, since this is the underpinning in some ways of your paper, your project, and my own interests. As Magda says, the book I have coming out is called Creole Noise. So we are both of us very much invested in the idea of Creole as culture, as politics, as language, and yet in some ways we're still trying to nail down what is this thing. So with that being said, one of the things that in your one of the many fascinating things that you mentioned in your presentation is the language of that there are two kinds of Creole language in Suriname, and one is called so-called Negro English, right? And the other, I guess, is derived from the Dutch, right? So you have these two streams of Creole, which is not that uncommon in the wider Caribbean as well. But what interests me again is what you described, the political dimensions of that word choice, right? So if we say, forgive my pronunciation, if Shranan is the Creole, right? That's associated with Black people, because of course Creole is a language and it's a culture, right? And often when we say Creole, it can mean many things, but in this particular case, it is also associated with people of African descent, who I will call Black. And in your presentation, you said there's a moment, I'm trying to remember that I think it's in the 18th century, where Ashkenazic women are heard to be conversing with enslaved Black people in Shranan, right, in Creole, and that the Portuguese or the Iberian Jewish observer is distressed by this, right? So that moment to me opens up a world of contradiction, a world of ambivalence, if you will, about the meaning of Creole. Here we have the older Jewish Creole population, the Iberian Jewish population, the observer, looking at the newer population, that is the Ashkenazic women, talking in a language I think that is associated with Blackness, right? And distressed by what appears to be what I'm reading between the lines here is encroaching Blackness, right? That at this moment in the 18th century, there is a need for Jewish identity to be seen as not Black, to be seen as part of a kind of a European elite that is a slaveholding elite, that is a plantocratic elite. And of course, parenthetically, I'm also thinking of William Blake, the English poet, and he was also also an artist, a lithographer. He has you probably have seen it. There's an amazing lithograph of a Surinamese planter in his morning dress with a half-dressed mixed race Black, well, I would call Black, mixed race woman serving him Madeira. And the context is that he's looking at he's going to look at the his enslaved Black people being whipped that morning, and so it's supposed to, you know, suggest decadence, right? But coming back to this moment that you describe of this, these women conversing in this Creole, and these Jewish women conversing in Creole, and these a Jewish observer being chagrined by this, I'm thinking of that image of a white Creole planter, the Surinamese planter, as envisioned by William Blake, who of course is coming from the Anglophone world. And he sees the white Surinamese planter as simply a white Surinamese planter in contradistinction to Blackness, right? Whereas the moment you're pointing out suggests a moment where it's not stable. Blackness is part of the language of Ashkenazic women, right? That they're speaking in Creole blackens them, and yet, and again, this is where I seek your knowledge as a scholar. It seems to me from your presentation that there is a subtle racial distinction between Ashkenazic and Portuguese Jews in Suriname, that Portuguese Jews, who are the older community, are associated with Creole, you know, basically with Creolization. In other words, they are darker, they're blacker, they're the photographs that you show are, you know, would be in an Anglophone context called brown people, right? Ashkenazic women sound like they're more, you know, this community would be coming from a white or more Europeanized community, right? So you have a community that sounds that they are associated more ethnically with people of African descent, who are chagrined by the appearance of Blackness in more unproblematically white Jewish people. And so again, for me, this opens up the problem of ambivalence, right? What counts as a true Jewish Caribbean identity in that context, right? The Portuguese Jews who have been there, who are culturally speaking maybe more connected to this Africanized, this African community, or this newer Ashkenazic community that is interested in conversing, in communicating with this with these enslaved people. So politics and culture sound to be like two different things, right? So that's the one thing that I'm curious about, that culture, Creole as culture and Creole as politics, or Creolite as politics, are not the same thing. I was also interested, and I'm sorry if I'm sort of grabbing at many things because your presentation brought up so much. I was also interested in the governor, that the moment you describe of the anti-Semitic governor, whose name is going to escape me, Lohman, is it? Yes, from what, this is after the abolition of slavery, I believe, what, 1872 or so?
1890.
1890, right? Okay, so right at the cusp of the 20th century, who exploits Creole, and I'm using the word Creole now in terms of the sense of Black people, again, not always a stable term racially speaking. He uses that to foment the kind of sort of anti-Semitic discourse that appears in the paper of the Creole language newspaper aimed at Black working class people, right? And I had questions about that. A governor, again, I don't know if Suriname structure, political structure follows that of other colonial societies, but a governor is a political appointee of a colonial state, no? So here we have a governor that I'm assuming is appointed by, in the Netherlands, to continue colonial policy, who is hostile to the local colonial apparatus, right? I'm going to mess up the name again. The colonial, I think it's called the colonial state, basically.
Yeah, the colonial states.
The colonial states, which are basically a collection of civil servants who are heavily Jewish, are heavily represented by the Jewish community. So you have colonial governor in conflict with the colonial state apparatus. And that's, there's so much I need to unpack about that. I don't, that how can that be? The governor represents the colony. To be a governor is to engage, to me, in pro-colonial sentiment. But from what you're describing, he fomented an how do I put this? An anti-colonial sentiment in a Black Creole population that saw the local Jewish population as or the representative of colonial elites. I don't know what to do with that. Because again, it suggests that again that there's a lot of movement between what you describe in, say, the 17th, 18th centuries and the 19th century, and even going forward into your description of the 20th century with the story of Abraham Philip Sampson. So I guess I'm going to stop there for a minute and ask if you could comment a bit on those particular moments of the Creole language as both a cultural glue between the Creole communities, Jewish, Black, and otherwise, and as a form of anti-Semitic discourse. I'll stop here, but another thing that you said that I found fascinating is that this anti-Semitic discourse occurred in a Creole language newspaper. I've forgotten the name, but the very fact that it's a Creole language newspaper also interested me, because Creole historically is is primarily oral. So to write it down is itself an act of, usually, those who possess the means to do so, right? Highly educated communities tend to write the semantics of Creoles, right? So that interested me because you said that this is a newspaper aimed at Black working class people. But to read in Creole means that you have to be highly educated, right? Certainly that's true in the Anglophone Caribbean, right? To read a Creole means I have to understand standard English in order to understand the written. So how did that work? I don't understand, how that works, especially because certainly in terms of the research I know, many Black and brown people particularly were offended by representations of Creole speech in narrative, right? That they were trying to distance themselves from bad language, so to speak. So what you're describing here is very different from what I've seen. And in fact, in neighboring, as it was called, British Guiana, there were many newspapers by men of color, as they were called, that made a point of not writing in Creole, right? In contrast to the white associated newspapers, right? That very much indulged, because it was seen as because Black people saw it as racist, right? That these people are looking down at us. So here you are describing something that is completely different. And I'm just curious as to whether you've looked at comparatively at how that works, because it seems to me the comparison highlights the singularity of the Surinamese experience in many ways. I'm going to stop here because I've thrown a lot at you, and I'm really interested to hear what you have to say.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'll try to go in the order of your questions. and you might have to remind me some details here and there, but my sense is that when the Portuguese observer of Ashkenazic women speaking the so-called Negro English to people that they enslaved, there is an internal Jewish dynamic. You're absolutely correct, in the sense that the Iberian Jews, the Portuguese Jews of Suriname, saw themselves as the founders of the colony itself and the defenders of the slave system that made the colony as rich as it was in the 17th and 18th centuries. But what you see is that even in Suriname, very distant from the European experience, the stereotype of Ashkenazic Jews as lower class, as a kind of ugly hybrid between German and Jewish, and in particular, I think that Nasi is the person who was making this remark about the women that were speaking the Creole language to their slaves, was evoking the charge that had been leveled against Yiddish for centuries, which was that it was an ugly jargon with no intellectual depth, and that when Ashkenazic Jewish women, presumably native speakers probably of either Eastern or Western Yiddish, came to this colony of Suriname, they simply transferred their European jargon to the jargon of the local colony. And so that kind of comment, also there's obviously a very deep gendered aspect to this, in the sense that within traditional Jewish cultural worldview that Nasi probably had, and that many Jews of that period of time had, women were seen as sometimes dangerously close to non-Jewish culture, and therefore evoking this in contrast to men. So Jewish women were in the marketplace in contrast to men who were charged with studying rabbinic texts. These kinds of stereotypes or images of Ashkenazic Jewry were transferred to the colonial situation and racialized, really, in the sense, like you say, there was a perception among this Portuguese elite that Ashkenazic Jewish women in particular were just too close to enslaved people, and in that sense would upset what they often describe as a very delicate equilibrium between the planter class, a very unstable relationship, violent at times relationship between the planter class and the class of enslaved people. So there's no doubt that there is, you could say, a racialization of Ashkenazic Jews in this particular instance. Your second question was about defining Creole, right? It was about trying to understand. Sorry, you were talking about. Sorry, can you repeat it just one more time? I apologize.
I don't even know which question that was.
I can talk about loan. I think is probably better, and then we can come back to the Creole question. So in terms of the Creole newspaper and how there could be a Creole newspaper, a Sranan-Tonga newspaper in Suriname in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, goes back to the very peculiar relationship that the colony had to the Christian missions. So like I said in the presentation, the Dutch colonial authorities forbid the Christianization of the slaves. They considered it dangerous to give a Christian education to people that were enslaved. It would impart on them a dignity that they felt they did not deserve. That's usually how it's described as to why Christianity or missionaries were denied to people on plantations in Suriname. But there is a very important exception to this rule in the 1750s and the decades after, the Dutch government, sort of by turning a blind eye, allowed Moravian missionaries into the colony, but only on plantations where Jews were the owners of the colony. So there was this idea, because Jews were a higher proportion of slave owners at that time in the colony, they were accepting of de-Judaizing, or removing a Jewish element from the colony, Jewish control of the colony, you could say, if that's how they perceived it. And one of the ways they thought that they could mitigate the Jewish character of people that were enslaved, not Jewish in the sense that they were Jews themselves, but that they had been exposed to the beliefs of the Jews in a very close manner, they introduced Moravian missionaries. And the first things that the missionaries do in the 1750s and then into the 19th century is translate lots of their religious materials into Suriname Tonga. And they teach a special class of people how to read the Creole language. And so you'll find in archives in the Netherlands all kinds of religious texts, Christian texts, biblical texts in Suriname in the 1750s and the 1760s. And those who study Suriname Tonga, who study the Creole languages of Suriname, often have to rely, if they're talking in a historical linguistic way, they have to rely on these Christian texts. So by the end of the 19th century, there is an attachment among Creoles, among Black people, to the Moravian Church, not necessarily in the full sense of them becoming Moravian Christians, Protestant Christians, but in a kind of synthesis of their own Vinti, traditional religion with Christian symbols and Christian ideas and Christian theologies. Another way that they sort of tried to turn people who had been enslaved by Jews into anti-Semites was that they would use a tactic that the Israelites described in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, are actually closer in their spiritual state to an enslaved person. And thus you could give people enslaved by Jews a sense that they were living in a kind of biblical epic narrative where they were players in a revolt against Jewishness. And you have to also understand that these Moravian missionaries, of course, due to their name, were actually from Germany and the Czech lands, and were well acquainted with Judaism and Jewish culture. And some of them even had failed to convert Jews in Europe and then moved to the colonies to try something new. So the importation of a theology, an anti-Jewish theology, has its roots in the transcription of the Creole language in the translation of Christian texts into the Creole language. And that's one of the reasons that that sort of Creole nationalism, Black nationalism in Suriname is so connected to the church, and is so connected especially to the Moravian Church, which saw itself as the voice of the poor. So that's another thing. And I remember your second question, which was about the colonial government, the apparatus. How could a governor and then the colonial states be in conflict? So one of the interesting things about Suriname in the late 19th century is that for most of the slavery era, the Dutch took a relatively hands-off approach. So they forbid slaves to speak Dutch. They forbid the church. They really didn't have a sense of turning people that were enslaved into some image of a colonial subject. One of the reasons that Jews were allowed to flourish in Suriname is because of that hands-off approach. So what happens is, over the course of the 19th century, is a kind of panic in the Netherlands that the colony is just completely without any structure and without any rule. And one of the ways that they give structure to the colony of Suriname is by appointing a local government to do their bidding. But what happens over time is that this local government, that is predominantly Jewish and Surinamese in character, sees things differently than the governor who's actually in charge and from the Netherlands. So much of the 19th century is really a story of a wrangling between officials in the Netherlands, the Bureau of Colonial Affairs, and then the colonial states, who see themselves as the rightful rulers, really, because they're from there. They see themselves as both representatives of the colony of the Netherlands, but part and parcel of the colony itself, native to the colony, and more authentic in their ability to rule. What is interesting, I saw this in Lohman's archives, is that his daughter says in her memoirs, "I can't believe he was appointed. How could he have been appointed? He was so hostile to Jews. Why would they appoint him?" And it's left as an open mystery.
I will jump in that fascinating conversation you two have, because there are some really great questions related to what the two of you were talking about. And I guess I'll ask the questions. We don't have too much time, but to both of you. So it's about the idea of Creole, Creolization, Creolite, however and one question, I think the member of the audience is seeking comparison with negritude, right? And what that means in terms of creolity and negritude, and maybe connotations between. And the other person is asking about the meaning of it, that it seems to be very different in the Caribbean context from Criollo in the Central and South American Spanish-speaking context. In the latter, it refers to the descendants of European-born in the Americas. So, so I wonder whether you two could unpack this, I know, in 5 minutes, the question of Creole, Creolization, Creolite from these two comparative perspectives.
I'm going to let Eli have at it. That is many books, but I will have a crack after you, Eli. Go ahead.
Okay. Regarding the difference between the Spanish context and the Dutch context, I don't have too much knowledge on the Spanish realm, so I can't really comment too directly on that. In terms of the comparison to negritude, I think is actually a very interesting point, because I was trying to work out the attraction of Surinamese Jews to Zionism and to Jewish nationalism in the journal, mostly because it comes late. I mean, it's not something that exists in Suriname in the early 20th century. It really only appears in the 40s and the 50s when the Zionist project is quite well developed, and it's not an ideology that has much purchase in the community overall. But I do think that if we were to contrast Jewish political sensibilities in Suriname, local Jewish political sensibilities in Suriname, and try to map those sensibilities onto that famous distinction between creolite and negritude, the Jewish community was cognizant of and very aware of their ancient, of their connection to the Jewish past and of their connection to the broader Jewish diaspora. And Zionism gave them a language to locate their own particular situation in Suriname with a broader Jewish political identity. And negritude being an African-centered political and aesthetic movement, I think has a lot to contribute to our understanding of why Zionism took root in the community at this time, being that even within Caribbean intellectual circles with no connection to Jewishness, there was a tension between the here-ness of Creolity, of this idea that we are a hybrid people with many different cultural aspects, and then a negritude view, which was much more cognizant of the African roots of the diaspora in the Caribbean. So I guess that's my answer.
I just want to add on to what Eli is saying. One of the things that's interesting to me about the question in the chat also is the emphasis on the word. Of course, Creole does come from the word criollo, right? And the idea of criollo is to distinguish people of European descent who are born in the Americas from Europeans, right? So the idea is that it's race, ethnicity is not the ultimate determinant of culture. It is in fact where you're born. It is your culture. It is the way you speak, right? And to me, this is the link that we see between the different forms of Creole, right? Because I think as the term evolves and moves, the thing that we see connecting it is the idea that it's connected to difference, to taint, right? That somebody of, and again, I'm using the word pure with quotation marks around it, pure English descent or pure French descent or pure Dutch descent who grew up in, 17th century Suriname or, 17th, 18th century Jamaica is not the same. And in fact, I'm thinking of Jean Rees's book, White Sargasso Sea, when her, those of you who know the book, the English husband of this white Creole woman is thinking to himself, of pure English descent she may be, but she is not white. And that's the point. That ethnicity is not the thing, that culture is the thing. And so to me, the word Creole, despite its different iterations as referring to white people, and the early descriptions are about white people, not simply in South America, but also in my research in the Caribbean, not just Creole as people, but the language, the Creole language was considered a white language, not a black language, right? In fact, many of the English or European travelers would say, these white Creoles, they speak this gibberish, but they weren't talking about black people. So Creole speak Creole, and if the Creole is white, then the white person speaks this gibberish, this tainted language, and so it's this idea of taint that is the thread, right? So then Black people became the Creoles, right? Which is the version that we're seeing Eli working with in terms of Suriname or people of African descent. But again, it's the idea that not quite the same as African, right? A Black Creole is born in the Americas and therefore not pure, not therefore tainted. It then became sort of lionized as, créolité, hybridity, right? But that's part of the politics of time, right? The future belongs to the impure, I believe was Stuart Hall, right? But so you go, but taint, which becomes hybrid, which becomes politically useful in different contexts, is the thread. So coming back to the person's question about their link to Criollo, I would say this idea of difference. Mm-hmm. Difference that is not necessarily racial, difference that is cultural, that becomes politicized, that culture becomes a weapon, right? Mm-hmm. An anti-colonial weapon or even a pro-slavery weapon, depending on who's using it. I'm going to stop there. That opens a can of worms.
We have a lot of questions and we unfortunately can't get to them, but I want to promise those of you who asked them that we will pass those questions to the speakers and maybe they will respond to them. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Eli. Thank you, Belinda, for a really fantastic event and conversation. And I certainly know that I will be putting it for my students to watch and learn. Thank you for engaging, for learning from each other. It's really great model to follow. And thank you all of you who have joined us, and I invite you to our next event next week. So again, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.